lecture could be subtitled, "All the Intricate Things You Know That You Don't Usually Give Yourself Credit for Knowing When You Know English Grammar." Let's start by thinking about contractions in English. Not in terms of whether or not we should use contractions in formal writing. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. But in terms of where contractions can and cannot happen. We'll start with a straightforward and very common contraction. Did plus not, as in, I didn't swim. Now let's coordinate that sentence to see what happens. He swam, but I didn't swim. Okay, straightforward enough. Let's see what happens if we take off the end of that sentence. He swam, but I didn't. Seems completely fine, and it is fine. So in that coordinated sentence, you can omit the main verb, swim, and leave didn't stranded at the end of the sentence. This, I have to say, does not seem like an extraordinary fact at all. But it's not always possible in English to remove the end of the sentence, that main verb, and keep a contraction stranded there at the end of the sentence. Let me show you what I mean. Let's look at another common contraction. I plus am, as in I'm. Here's the sentence. I'm driving. Now let's coordinate that. Let's imagine that we were talking about carpools, and I said, she's driving, and I'm driving. Again, completely straightforward. Let's now try to omit the second verb. She's driving, and I'm. Clearly, we can't do that. You're probably sitting there saying, wait, she's not finished yet. She can't just end with I'm. With that, we cannot omit the main verb at the end of that clause and leave I'm stranded at the end of the sentence. We couldn't strand other pronouns contracted with auxiliary verbs to end a sentence or clause. Let's try this one. Who has traveled to South Africa? She has. Okay, there we omitted the verb, that was fine, but we did not contract the pronoun with the auxiliary verb. Let's try contracting it. Who has traveled to South Africa? She's. Again, you're saying that can't work because if I just say she's, it feels like I'm not finished with that sentence. This holds true also in comparative sentences, that we can't strand those contractions out there with a pronoun and an auxiliary or a pronoun and to be. Let me show you one where to be is the main verb, not an auxiliary verb or helping verb. And again, what we know is that you can't leave I'm stranded at the end of the sentence. Here's a version of the sentence without a contraction. She's taller than I am. Okay, completely fine. Now let's try contracting it. She's taller than I'm. Nope, can't do it. Now, there are detailed explanations in linguistics for exactly why it is that we can't leave those contractions stranded at the end of a clause or sentence, but we can leave didn't there at the end. I'm not going to get into those explanations here. My point is simply that you know this. You know when you can and can't end a clause with a contraction. Now, no one has ever taught you that. This is intuitive grammatical knowledge learned when you were a child. You just have a gut sense that she's taller than I'm is ungrammatical. And it's ungrammatical in a more fundamental way than a split infinitive is ungrammatical. And really, this is the difference between ungrammatical in the descriptive sense, as we'll be talking about in this lecture, and dispreferred. And the split infinitive is just dispreferred in some contexts. Your knowledge that she's taller than I'm is ungrammatical is fundamental to your linguistic competence as a speaker of English. As a linguist, I'm interested in the complex set of rules that allow us as speakers of English to make grammatical utterances. What I'm going to call this is our descriptive grammar. It describes our competence as speakers that allows us to string words together into utterances that make sense to other people. So what do we know when we know a language like English? Well, we know a lot, and we know a lot at different levels of the structure of the language. For example, we have a lot of knowledge about the sounds of the language. We know which sounds to pay attention to and which sounds are not distinctive in our language. Then, of course, we have an enormous competence around words. We know the vocabulary at our disposal. We also know how those words inflect. How do verbs make past tense? How do nouns make plural? Then there's all our competence around syntax. How can we string words together into clauses and sentences? Put on top of that, all our knowledge about the discourse conventions, which allows us to be competent speakers in everyday conversation. We know how to take turns. We know how to phrase things in more polite ways and less polite ways. This is all part of our competence as speakers. And then, in a highly standardized language like English, our competence may also include all the prescriptive rules that we know, the rules that we know that allow us to write or speak in more formal contexts and then to speak in less formal contexts. When I use grammatical in this lecture, I'm often going to be using it in the descriptive sense. And when I use it in this sense, here's what I mean. I mean that an utterance, if it's grammatical, is rule-governed. It obeys the rules in a language that string together words in a way that will be meaningful to other speakers, that the words are inflected in ways that will be meaningful to other speakers. In other words, that the sentence or utterance is systematically constructed according to the system of the language, for the order of the words, the agreement of nouns and verbs, that kind of thing. And when you have grammatical utterances that are systematically constructed, they can then be parsed by other speakers or readers if you're writing. In this sense, in the descriptive sense, a rule is actually an established pattern of usage that speakers recognize. When linguists write descriptive grammars trying to capture all of this knowledge, these grammars are huge. It's fascinating to compare those with style guides like Strunk and White, which are so slim by comparison. And there's a reason for that. Style guides capture only a small percentage of the usage issues in a language. Style guides go after those usage issues where there's variation, where perhaps there's a change in progress, and they try to tell us what is more and less proper usage. A descriptive grammar needs to capture the whole language, both where there's variation and where we all agree on the rules of a language. In this course, we'll spend a lot of time on the prescriptive rules that we feel we're supposed to know. And we'll also compare those with the rules, the patterns of actual usage. The most remarkable feature of the grammar of human languages is that we can create an infinite number of utterances from a finite set of resources. This was captured eloquently by Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was a German philosopher in the late 18th and 19th century and a linguist. He was also the brother of the famous naturalist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt. And what he said was, and here I quote, "Language makes infinite use of finite means." Interestingly, at one point I was telling students this in a course at the University of Michigan, and I said, language, we can create an infinite number of utterances from a finite set of resources. And a student raised his hand and he said, "Well, surely you do not mean infinite in the mathematical sense." And I thought, how else could I mean infinite? And I do mean infinite in the mathematical sense. I mean infinite. There is no limit. And this gets to human creativity. Yes, we make new words, and that's one of the wonderful parts of human creativity with language. But here, I'm talking about creativity with syntax, with grammar. I'm talking about how we can take the words we have and combine them in an infinite number of ways. This is what von Humboldt was getting at. Think about what you're doing right now as you listen to me. You're listening to sentences you've never heard before. I've never uttered these sentences in exactly this way before. And yet, I hope you're understanding me clearly, even though this sentence is entirely new for you. The way this works is that you and I agree on the conventions of language. We agree on what each linguistic sign means. In other words, if we take a sign like the word skunk, well, you and I all agree that that refers to a little critter that is black and white and can make a huge stink. Now, if I suddenly started using skunk to mean pillow, you and I would have a problem because now we wouldn't be able to communicate. But that's not the way human language works. There's a convention behind the signs. And then there's convention with grammatical rules or patterns. You expect me to have my subjects in particular places, my verbs in particular places, my determiners before the nouns. And when I do that, I can combine those nouns and verbs and in creative ways because they're in the right place for you, which allows you to parse the utterance. Now, how do we know that we can create an infinite number of utterances? Well, the answer is what linguists would call recursion. Recursion is the ability to embed an infinite number of elements into a grammatical structure. And once you can do this, there are no limits on how long or how new a sentence can be. An example is going to help here. Watch the way I'm going to embed clause inside clause in this sentence. Here comes the sentence. My sister explained that my nephew said that his sister whispered to him, that her friend had told her, that her brother said, that her mother said, that her father said, and I could keep putting in noun plus said forever. And each time I do that, the sentence is going to mean something new. He said, that she said, that we said, that I said. Each time, it means a new thing. And that's how we can say that the language is infinitely creative, because I can keep making new sentences that way. Now, of course, your brain can't actually process that sentence once I've embedded probably more than 4 of those clauses inside each other. Your brain says, I give up. I can't figure out what this sentence means, but I could keep going. Now, there is a current debate in the field about whether all human languages have recursion, but it has been a standing assumption that all human languages do. From this definition of grammar and grammatical, that is, that a language follows the rules or patterns of that language in order to communicate meaning, let's talk about what ungrammatical means. It would mean that a sentence does not follow the patterns of a variety of English. Now, we already talked about the sentence, she's taller than I'm, and I think we can all agree that that feels ungrammatical. Now, here's another example with word order. We know that the following sentence is just fine. A dog chased me down the street. Not that exciting, clearly grammatically fine. We know that this sentence is not fine. Dog chased me down the street the. You're probably having a little trouble following that. And that's because it's ungrammatical. I said dog and street the. But we know that determiners need to come before nouns. It needs to be a dog and the street. Here's another ungrammatical version. A dog chased me the street down. Nope. Because we know that prepositions need to come before the noun phrase. It should be down the street, not the street down. Let me just give you one more example. Dog me street down chased a the. Okay, so that's a total mess. It doesn't even follow subject, verb, object, word order. Those we can all agree are ungrammatical. What about the sentence, we don't have nothing to hide? Is that grammatical in the descriptive sense? To answer that question, let's start by thinking historically. Of course, what we're talking about here is double negation. And double negation is now considered non-standard. And I'll sometimes hear it described as illogical or wrong, which is, of course, different from being non-standard. And I would argue that calling double negation illogical or wrong is not fair. being non-standard does not make something wrong or illogical, or at least any more illogical than some of the things we consider standard. I want to talk about this here because the history of double negation shows us that the standard can change over time. And this is a really useful perspective to have as we think about descriptive and prescriptive grammar. All right, so double, or sometimes we call it multiple negation because you can have more than two. This occurs when we have more than one negative marker on the clause. So that could be not plus nothing, not plus no one, not plus never, not plus no. Now, of course, many languages in the world do this. We'll just take French as one example. If you want to say, I don't know in French, you would say, je ne sais pas, where the ne, je ne, is a negative, and the pas is also a negative. So French does double negation, completely standard. Standard American English now employs single negation. So we would say in standard varieties of English, we don't have anything to hide. But there is a long history of multiple negation in English. Let me give you a few examples from hundreds of years ago. The first one comes from a document called the Peterborough Chronicle, which was recording the history of Britain. This entry is from 1137, and it's describing the consequences of the Civil War under King Stephen. And here is the sentence. This would be early Middle English. The earth ne bar non corn. Okay, if we were to translate that directly into modern English, it would be something like, the earth not bore no corn. So you'll see the double negation, not and no. In standard English now, we'd say, the earth didn't bear any corn. Here's Chaucer with some double negation. This is from the description of the knight in the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales. He never yet no villainy ni said. Okay, so there we have never. We also have no and ne. So we, in fact, have triple negation. If we were to translate it directly, it would be something like, he never, no evil thing not said. Or, to translate it into modern standard English, he never ever said anything vile or evil. Those three negatives in there, we probably should read as just emphatic. Let me give you one more historical example of double negation, this one from Shakespeare. This is from As You Like It, and we have Celia asserts, I cannot go no further. A nice double negation. The system for making negation in earlier forms of English was just different from the way it is now. So you could have double or multiple negation. You had the ne rather than not, and it was inserted right before the verb. So ne bar with the corn example, or ne said, didn't say. We now use not, and it is inserted after an auxiliary verb, so cannot, has not, did not say. Standard varieties of English no longer use double negation, but it's important to note that many varieties of English continue to use double negation, and this is carrying on a long tradition in the language. Now, there is a myth out there that two negatives cancel each other out. And I have to say that is clearly not true in these cases. If we think about something like, we don't have nothing to hide, it is clear to all of us that that does not mean we have something to hide. Those negatives do not cancel each other out. I will hear people say, but in math, if you multiply two negatives, you get a positive. Okay, that is true, but I have two responses to that. One is, language is not math. The second is, okay, fine, let's do math. If you have two negatives in math and you add them, what do you get? You actually get a bigger negative. Now, It is true that there are some double negatives in modern English where the negatives do cancel each other out, or at least kind of cancel each other out. If you think about the phrase, not unhappy. Well, clearly the not and the un are contradicting each other and counteracting each other. But I would also argue that not unhappy is not the same thing as happy. If I'm not unhappy, I'm just not unhappy. It does not mean I'm all the way to happy. I also want to note here that there is a way that we can use intonation on a double negative to make those two negatives cancel each other out. For example, we don't have none, which would mean, okay, so we have some. But if I were to say it differently, we don't have none. That means we don't have any. So, to answer my question of is double negation grammatical, we must consider double negation grammatical for many varieties of English. It is not formal, it is not standard, but it's completely systematic, and it's well understood by speakers of all varieties. When Pink Floyd says, "We don't need no education," we all know exactly what they mean. This is a good moment to make a key point about how English grammar works. And that is that there isn't just one English grammar. All varieties of English spoken in speech communities have systematic grammars, and they don't all stem from Standard English. I think it can be tempting, because Standard English is such a prominent presence, to think that all the other varieties come derived from that, but that's not actually true. The Standard was just elevated for social and political reasons. We need to talk about English grammars in the plural, as there are many varieties of English. Standard American English is just one of them. Standard English will be the focus of much of this course, but I will often point out differences in other varieties and talk about how the standard variety has changed over time. Now let's return to negation, and we'll take the kind with just one negative, the kind in Standard American English. If we step back from a negative sentence to examine what is at work, or what's at play here, it can give you a taste of just how much you know when you know English grammar. Let's take a very simple, straightforward sentence. It did not rain. What do you need to know to construct that sentence in terms of the negation? Well, you need to know that the not goes after the auxiliary verb. It did not rain. You would not say, it not did rain, or not it did rain. Then we know that we could contract it. It didn't rain. And of course, the auxiliary verb comes before the main verb. We say it didn't rain, not it rained didn't. I know that I'm saying things that are so completely obvious to you, but in fact you did have to learn these when you were a kid. Now, what happens if there's more than one auxiliary verb in the sentence? Take, for example, the cake has been eaten. We have two auxiliaries, has and been. Well, what you know is that the not goes in after the first auxiliary. The cake has not been eaten. You would not say, the cake has been not eaten. Or if you did, that would be for a particular rhetorical purpose. It wouldn't be just a generic negation. And again, you would know when you could contract. You know you can say, the cake hasn't been eaten. That's a lot of knowledge about how to insert not to make a negative sentence that you probably have never had to spell out that way before. You just learned it when you were a kid. And interestingly, you went through stages learning it. Kids often say things like, no wear shoes, before they get the rule that you need an auxiliary verb plus not. What are other examples of descriptive rules of the language? Well, we've already covered some. Determiners come before nouns. And there is an order to those determiners, which we'll be talking about. You would say, all her many friends, not her all many friends. We know that adjectives will come between the determiner and the noun. So we would say something like, a silly song, where silly comes between a and song. Another descriptive rule, well, to make most nouns plural, add s. Silly songs. And once we've made it plural, we know that we can't use a. You can't say a silly songs, but you could say the silly songs. We also talked about how prepositions precede the noun phrase. We would say, in my head. And if we want to talk about the silly songs in my head, we would say, silly songs in my head, not silly in my head songs. I know that these rules seem very basic and not worth spending time on, but it's powerful stuff to remember how much we know when we know English grammar. The usage rules that we worry about, is it less or fewer here? Can I split that infinitive? Are just a fraction of the universe of English grammar. What I'll show you is that being able to compare how the language works descriptively with the rules we're told to follow in formal speech and writing can help you make even more informed decisions about usage. And you'll gain a new perspective on some of the rules you may have learned in school or elsewhere. What do I mean by this new perspective? Well, let's return to double negation. We've discussed that historically, double negation has been rule-governed and continues to be rule-governed or grammatical in many varieties of English, and of course in many other languages. But in the 18th century, Bishop Lowth, in his very influential grammar, introduced the idea that negatives could cancel each other out. Now, the example he gave from Paradise Lost is an example where the negatives do counteract each other. The sentence was, nor did they not perceive the evil plight in which they were. And there you can see the nor and the not are counteracting, at least to some extent. The issue is that that piece of advice or that statement he made about how those two negatives cancel each other out to make a positive got extended in later guides, and it got extended to sentences like, we don't have nothing to hide. And then those sentences were declared illogical as if those negatives canceled each other out. We now avoid double negatives in standard American English, and it's not a prestige form. And what I'm struck by is that it is, as I've said, so often condemned as wrong or bad English. But what I hope I've shown you is that there's nothing inherently wrong or uneducated about the construction. In fact, it used to be high writing. And would you believe that some people thought that the move to single negation in standard varieties of English wasn't necessarily a good thing? There's a great quote from the London Review, published in 1864, and it's republished in Fitzedward Hall's book Modern English in 1873. And this quote laments the loss of double negation as one of the many lamentable changes in the English language. It sets up the King James Bible, published in 1611, as the high point of English usage, and since then, all the changes have been for the worse. And it states, and here I quote, "The double negative has been abandoned to the great injury of strength of expression." You don't hear that complaint anymore, or you don't never hear that in usage guides now. Now, just to be clear, I'm not advocating that we all suddenly start using double negation in formal prose, although there would be absolutely nothing wrong with that, or that we stop teaching students about the issue. It's important to teach students about the standard use, but it's equally important not to condemn the non-standard use, as this isn't well-founded. I want you to just imagine a student who is a speaker of a variety of English that uses double negation coming into a classroom and being told that the two negatives in "we don't have nothing" cancel each other out. That student knows that that's not true. And suddenly, if you've said that, you're the one who loses some credibility because that just clearly isn't true to the grammar. To recognize these different definitions of grammatical is, to me, what it means to be careful about our grammar, to be sure that what we're saying is accurate and fair about how both prescriptive and descriptive grammar work. What I'm trying to do is separate out the social judgment that we put onto grammar from the grammar itself. It's helpful for us to understand that social judgment and be able to navigate it as speakers and writers. We want to know our audience, and we don't want to distract them or annoy them. It is also intellectually interesting to see how those judgments change over time. I would argue that this perspective and background knowledge actually make us better editors and teachers because we understand the formal written variety in the context of all the varieties of English out there. And I have to say, as a teacher, I have found it a more engaging and empowering way to think about and to teach grammar. It gives us credit for all that we already know and acknowledges the variation that we know is out there. We know that some people use single negatives, some people use double negatives. And we know that both of those constructions can function really well in context. Part of mastering the game of the formal standards in writing and speech is to understand how these usage rules may ask us to switch up our language from informal to formal contexts, from speech to writing. My hope is that all of this knowledge, this perspective, can make grammar playful again, as opposed to a world of absolute rights and absolute wrongs. We, as humans, love to play with language, and I don't want people to fear grammar, to have that red pen frightened feeling when they hear the word grammar. It's interesting to think about not just whether one can use double negation in formal writing at this point. Most of the time, no, unless for specific rhetorical purposes. But I also want to think about why Standard English uses single negation when many languages and older varieties of English use double negation. That's worth talking about. That's history. That's diversity. That's really deeply understanding English grammar. With all of this background on different approaches to grammar, it's time to dive into the details of parts of speech. How many parts of speech did you learn there are in English? If you learned that there are 8, I'm going to add a few more. And in this lecture, we've talked a lot about the word not. Where does that fit in terms of parts of speech? What about the word We'll address these questions in the next lecture.